So, without further ado,
Thanks
I'll,
very much.
introduce, Larry Forbes, who tell us about Rayleigh-Taylor flows.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me and wherever Jean-Marc's gone. Thank you for inviting me along, Jean-Marc. Jean-Marc and I were actually students together at Adelaide University. You were more Ernie Tuck students, and I was more a student of a fellow called Len Schwartz, who some of you may know. Jean-Marc was about 3 or 4 years ahead of me and did brilliantly as a student and left in a blaze of glory, and then that kind of left me struggling with a problem not dissimilar to what Professor Aculis has talked about. I was looking at flow over semicircular bumps on bottoms, and I was struggling with radiation conditions and all the sort of things, some of the things that you mentioned. Len Schwartz kind of said to me one day, "Well, it's a pity you're not as smart as Jean-Marc." You might have been able to do something with this. So, okay. So I've known Jean-Marc a long time. That's the point of that. So what I want to talk about today is these Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities. I can't quite remember how I came against them, but I'm in a department of maths and physics, and the physics people are astronomers. And astronomers, you get these marvelous images of really fluid mechanics looking things. Maybe more of us should get involved in that stuff. You see these beautiful outflows, and you see, things on a galactic scale that look like what we see in the laboratory. It's quite extraordinary. And in fact, there was a paper by some astronomers that came out about 10 years ago that mentioned the Rayleigh-Taylor instability. And the title of the paper is something like "On a scale from 1 millimeter to 1 parsec," So these things occur on huge length scales and everything. Now, all right, I better tell you what they are if you don't know. Oh, one of the things I wanted to say is Steve Walters is a collaborator of mine. He was a PhD student in physics. Ridiculously clever guy who built a supercomputer in his office. The fastest computer in my state of Tasmania is the thing on his desk. I don't know how he did it. And Ross Turner is a young postdoc who is an astronomer. All right. If you don't know what it is, let me start with a kind of tutorial, if you like. The Rayleigh-Taylor instability, it's a famous problem due to Lord Rayleigh and Sir G.I. Taylor from 1930s, and then Taylor was working on it in the 50s. Basically, you have a heavy fluid on top of a light fluid, and of course that's unstable. You've got an interface between them. That's what happens when you paint the ceiling, I suppose. The heavy fluid will sit there, and the light fluid will sit there, but the minute you disturb the interface, of course, instabilities grow. Any wave on the interface will grow. And of course, you know what wants to happen. The heavy fluid wants to punch down and the light fluid wants to come up. And so you get these spikes of heavy fluid down and bubbles of light fluid going up. And so that's the famous Rayleigh-Taylor instability. And the linear theory, which again, you mentioned, the linear theory was done to death by Sir G.I. Taylor and by Lord Rayleigh, and it shows these exponential growth in time of an instability. So that's what that's about. Here is the sort of classical linear theory of it. Before I do, it's always good to have some nice pictures. You typically get this. These are pictures that I more or less stole from the internet. This is one that you can actually do with cooking oil, of various different densities, and you see the light fluid rising up and the heavy fluid going down. This is a terrifying image of a thunderstorm somewhere in Germany, which was, well, I wouldn't have wanted to be in that building. This is a kind of a meteorological thing over the plains of Kansas, I think. This is another Rayleigh-Taylor type instability in a glass of water with cooking oil in it. And this is a famous image of the Crab Nebula on a gigantic scale, and the astronomers claim that these fingers coming in are Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities. You probably have to stick around for 5 million years to check that, and so I'm probably fairly, well, safe in claiming something like that. Let me show you the sort of classical work that Rayleigh and Taylor did a long time ago. So here it is in, what have I got? I've got depth H2 above and a depth H1 below. I think I've ignored H1 in that, it doesn't much matter. The classical solution, if your interface is centered around 0, yours was centered around a height D. Here I've got it centered around a height 0. So my interface is just eta is 0. And then you disturb it with a non-dimensionalized wavelength of 2 pi, so you have a cos x. The coefficient of time out the front, which blows up like an exponential in time, cosh of some rate RT, where the R is more or less the square root of the density ratio -1 over the density ratio +1. This thing's called the Atwood number, very famous thing. So if the density ratio is infinite, this number is 1. If the density ratio is 1, the two fluids are the same, the Atwood number is 0. This doesn't blow up as you'd expect. So that's the classical famous linear Taylor instability with a single interface. I got interested in it for a number of reasons. With 3 fluids and 2 interfaces, essentially because that's what the astronomers claim they see. But these things also occur in, this could be an atmospheric intrusion layer, a heavy fluid punching into a lighter fluid or something. Apparently these things also occur in reactors, nuclear and otherwise, where this thing is steam or something and these two are heavy fluids. They also occur in geophysics, but I'm not quite sure of the application there. This is the problem I want to talk about briefly today. Now you can have more interesting behaviors because you don't just have one interface that can become unstable or stable. You've now got 2, and so you can have a number of propagation modes. If you have an unstable situation, the 2 interfaces might move sinusously, in phase, or they might move in a varicose mode, out of phase like that, which is what I've drawn there. And if you go ahead and do the standard linear theory, which I like doing, you get something that looks a bit like this. You get a great big mess of algebra, but the idea is very simple, really. You end up now with 2 of these instability numbers, an R1 and an R2, if you like. This is classical linear theory. The 2 numbers are the roots now of a rather nasty quartic equation, which you can do a little bit with. But it turns out that just the algebra is horrible. I'd love to be able to say, this shows that it goes unstable when, but it's actually not quite that simple, because you've now got these 2 density ratios and you've got depth and things. So it's a little bit messy, but you can do it all. So again, it's kind of similar. You get what might be exponential blow up in time times a wave of dimensionless length 2 pi, and you get these perturbations, Okay, that's the sort of standard linear theory. What we wanted to do next was to try to look at solving the nonlinear problem. And it's clear, if you look at linear theory, both in this case and in the classical Rayleigh-Taylor case, of course, linear theory has a very finite lifetime, which is a bit like what you mentioned, only now time is the essence, perhaps, rather than an epsilon. Linear theory says your interface doesn't change, it's nearly flat, but then it contradicts itself and says your interface is blowing up exponentially with time. You can't have both of those things happening at once. So something's got to give. So what it basically says is that linear theory is all very fine while you've got a small amplitude disturbance, but when the amplitude disturbance is predicted to blow up exponentially, then linear theory can't possibly hold. So non-linearity must become important. And it's well known that it does in the Rayleigh-Taylor instability. People talk about non-linear saturation and all that sort of stuff. And that's what I wanted to look at here in this interface problem. So what we wanted to try to do was solve this thing numerically. When Jean-Marc and I were students at Adelaide University with Ernie Tuck, we might have tried to do this with integral equations, but it turns out that's kind of horrible because very quickly you get these curvature singularities. Non-linearity, as the interface grows in amplitude, non-linearity causes the interface to form a curvature singularity, and the inviscid model fails. So what we wanted to do was to put in some fluid viscosity, if we could, to stop the whole thing failing before anything interesting happened. That's a famous result, the curvature singularity, due to Derek Moore in 1979 in a ridiculously difficult paper to read. I wish I understood that paper as well as I should. But essentially what Moore showed was that when you have an infinitesimally thin interface, most of the time it will form a curvature singularity and the problem will die. There are some exceptions. If the interface is also stretching, you might, the crinkling due to the nonlinear waves, if that's not as much as the stretching of the background interface, you might get away with it, but usually you don't. So what we wanted to do is put some fluid viscosity in to stop these curvature singularities. It turns out that that's not quite enough. It isn't just it's not just that the fluid was inviscid that caused the curvature singularities. Viscosity can also give you things on the interface that look rather like curvature singularities, essentially are. And what you need is a diffuse interface. You have to get away from the sort of problems that you and I were doing as students. And instead of having an infinitesimally thin interface, you have to have an interface of some finite width. And you can show that that's basically what these methods do that work. So if any of you know about vortex Broad methods, that's essentially what they do. They smudge out the interface and get away from a single interface, smudge the thing out. So what we developed is a thing which I like to call the completed Boussinesque approximation. If you know what the Boussinesque approximation is, what it does is very naive. It says we've got these 2 or 3 different density regions, and what we do is we assume now that the densities are all very nearly similar. So the bottom density can be rho 1 or something. Then this is rho 1 plus a little bit, and this is rho 1 plus a little bit. And we just make some approximations about the little bit, and away we go. So the good thing about that is that now you no longer have to follow what your interface is doing explicitly in any sort of numerical method. Now you're not dealing with a sharp interface with 2 fluids. You're dealing with a density region, a fluid, like a single fluid with a density that changes smoothly but continuously in an interfacial region. So that's nice. It means you get away from having to worry too much about the interface, but you pay a price. And the approximation actually is not that good. I mean, it's got this advantage that you get the interface for free, but you're making some fairly severe approximations. And in particular, here's what you're doing. what classical Boolean-esque theory does is it takes the compressible continuity equation and rather artificially splits it into two. And it says there's an incompressible bit, div if the velocity is 0, plus a kind of a correction term for the density perturbation. This is like a transport equation, isn't it, really? Rho T and the unit grad rho, that's transporting this density perturbation. And often people will put in a diffusion term here with a kind of an Ekman number or something out the front. You can justify this in a number of ways. It doesn't have to be density perturbation. It could be salinity or temperature if you want. That's not too bad. Where Boolean-esque theory dies, it's classical Boolean-esque theory. Here's the Navier-Stokes equation. Density times acceleration, medians of pressure, buoyancy, viscous diffusion. What classical Boolean-esque theory does is it just shrugs and it says, well, you know, that term's pretty small. Let's throw it away. Cross that one off. And that's where your real bad approximation comes in. Turns out that's a disaster, you know, in terms of getting things right. So what we wanted to do was have a kind of Boolean-esque theory that kept that in exactly. So that's why I've called this a completed Boolean-esque theory. And you can do it, but you pay a fairly heavy numerical price. So here we go. Well, what we decided to do was to take curl of the Navier-Stokes equation and get a vorticity equation out. So you get out something that looks like that. So you get, okay, I've non-dimensionalized it now. 1 plus your perturbation, a rate of change of vorticity, some non-linear convective terms of vorticity. You take curl and you get rid of the pressure. That's why people do it. And this is the viscous term acting on the vorticity. And these are horrible non-linear terms, NL for non-linear. I haven't bothered writing out what they are, but, you know, they're easy enough to derive. So now this is the exact Navier-Stokes vorticity equation. We're solving for vorticity. We're using a stream function in 2 dimensions. So the velocity components are given by derivatives of the stream function. And there's our incompressible equation again, div q is naught. So that's exact. And now what we want to do is try to solve it using spectral methods, because they're a lot of fun and they're very exact. You know, they're very accurate, I mean, and you can do nice things with them. And it's not hard to convince yourself that the stream function and the density perturbation look something like that. All right, where we've got this kind of numerical wave number thing for each mode. All right. And that's okay. You can plug that into divergence of the velocity is naught. That's straightforward. You can plug it into the transport equation for your density perturbation, and that's straightforward. That's good. And now you plug it into the Navier-Stokes vorticity equation. Yeah, now it gets hard. So you plug into your transport equation and you get differential equations for the Fourier coefficients, and you can just march them forward in time. That's okay. The problem is that when you get to the vorticity equation for the exact Navier-Stokes equation, you now end up with sort of integral equations. Well, matrix equations for these derivatives of the coefficients. And there's simply no easy way around it. It's a nasty, big, linear matrix equation to be solved at each time step. And it's so big that really you can't just bash it out mindlessly on a computer. You've got to do something. So we've done various iteration schemes on it. which work reasonably well up until reasonably large density ratios. But there's more work to be done on that. Because I haven't got a lot of time, I'll keep going. Here's some of the things that we well, we've done some preconditioning of the thing, which is a good idea. We need a much more clever preconditioner because the aim is ultimately to be able to push this thing up to density ratios of like 1,000 or something, so we can do genuine free surface problems. We're not there yet. So we're still working on that. Here are some results though. So start off comparing with the linear theory. I've got too many lines on this picture, haven't I? I've tried to show dimensionless times at 3, 12, and 15. And at 3, linear, non-linear theories are agree pretty much exactly, which says, okay, we've at least got something right. And then as time goes on, linear theory, of course, gets silly. You've got these interfaces that blow up exponentially and they can cross over each other and do all sorts of non-physical things. So at this last time of 15, here the two interfaces predicted by linear theory have crossed over each other. So that's silly. The non-linear ones start to roll off like that. Here they are, you know. So they agree very well with the linear theory at early times, small amplitudes, rather like what you discovered. Moderate times, yeah, they agree all right. At larger times, there's no possibility of agreement because linear theory breaks down. All right. So we started to compare with, now, Ross Turner, I mentioned at the beginning, is an astronomer, and astronomers love these SPH codes that you may have seen. These, what are they called? Smooth particle hydrodynamics. Have you seen those things? Astronomers love those because you can just run them and they'll give you these really good looking, you know, astronomy jets and things. You say to them, what's the code doing? Giving me answers, you know. Ross is rather smarter than that. And we took one of these commercial SPH codes and we tinkered with it to try to make it look like an incompressible fluid and do all that sort of thing. And we compared it with our completed Busson-esque numerical method. And it does all right, it does okay. So there's a sinuous mode where the two interfaces are in phase. And here's a varicose mode where they're out of phase like that. And it's doing pretty well. At later times, I think what happens at later times is that these SPH codes start to stick to the wall here and all, you know, funny things like that. Whereas what I've assumed is a periodic behavior. So I think that explains what we're seeing here a little bit. All right. Then we've been able to look at some, you know, we let Steve Walters with his purpose-built supercomputer. Here's Steve, go for your life. And he was able to run these things with varicose and sinuous modes. And here are some of the results we've been getting. So what have we got? We've got density ratios of, that density is 1. That's 1. And the middle layer is heavier. It's a kind of intrusion flow, an atmospheric inversion layer, if you like. And here it is running in the two modes, sinuous and varicose. And in both cases, you know, the middle fluid being the heaviest of the three starts to fall down and form these kind of shapes, a bit like a lava lamp, you know. Here we are again. This is really interesting because the middle layer, as time goes on, the middle layer kind of gets played out of the game, you know. It ends up just being these kind of funny little green curly things here and here. And you end up essentially almost with a two-fluid flow again. So the heavy top fluid is just going down to the bottom. And this poor little middle fluid is just kind of sticking around the edges here and forming these interesting little spirals. Here's some more of them. And Stop in a sec. Here are some more of them. That's what varicose mode or something. And it's again, this is kind of interesting because the middle fluid actually now punches right down to the bottom, and the top two are still fighting it out. All right. Well, there's some more. I won't dwell on this. Here's some more. Here's a, I hope this works because this looks cool. Here's an animation that Steve made. Come on, there we go. We can see it rolling up and everything. It's a level of computing that I can't even get close to. But so, all right, I shall stop there. Thank you very much for listening.